already almost on time, let's put it that way. So I think we'll try to get started, and maybe ask very kindly our speakers to really stick to the time, or even shorten a little bit, so that we can protect the Q&A and the coffee break. So that's the goal of the chair today. So my name is Stephane Hallegatte. I'm a climate change advisor with the Sustainable Department practice group at the World Bank. And I'm very happy to chair this session on city resilience to climate change. So we'll have, let me go through the session very briefly. We'll have what in the program is a mini keynote speech, but I think we can just call that a keynote speech from Lint Barrage on municipal climate risks and policy opportunities. So very happy to have Lint with us. I think she's connected remotely, so I don't see her anywhere, but I hope the connection works. After this keynote, we'll have two presentations. One by Selod, so senior economist in the development research groups at the World Bank. And here the topic will be the welfare impact of floods in a city model looking at formal and informal housing. So this is a case study on Cape Town. And the second presentation will be from Remi Jedwab, I hope I pronounce it well, with the question of, is the world overbuilding in future bad locations? So how to edge durable construction globally. And finally, we have Nancy Lozano, senior economist at the World Bank, as a discussant for all of the topics. So I'm very happy we have this session, and a session that combines some modeling aspects, some policy aspects, and some empirical aspects. I think there is a lot of value in combining these different tools instead of following them in separate lines. So I hope that the combination of the three presentations can add to more than the sum of the parts, and that we can discuss how we make those different approaches to talk to each other, and especially discuss how we can use those models calibrated and validated with the type of empirical analysis to really do policy advice and do more than just doing estimates, but really provide some advice. And I would really like that we discuss the strengths of the different tools that we will be shown today to not only better understand, but also provide actual advice to people asking very concrete questions about how to manage the growth of cities with risks which are uncertain, which are changing over time, and with an ability to control urban development, which is very far from perfect, with a very large part of the development being informal. So because we're late, I suggest we jump right in, and I'll just invite Lint, which I now see on the screen, to get us started. Lint, over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Stephane. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can see, and we can hear you.
Excellent. Wonderful. All right. So in my remarks today, I'd like to make three basic points. The first is that climate change poses a myriad of physical risks to cities. And qualitatively, that's intuitive, I think, to everyone in the room, but I think it's also helpful to review some of the numbers in addition to the ones that we've already seen today. One aspect of the numbers I'd like to highlight, and my remarks will focus on the United States, is that some benchmark population projections imply that risks will be exacerbated by migration and the location of population growth. So on average in the United States, we appear to be moving towards areas of high and increasing risk rather than away from them. A second point I'd like to highlight is that there's now emerging evidence that in addition to some of the better understood physical direct risks, climate change is also set to put fiscal pressures on local public finances. And as a result of some of these fiscal pressures, at some point taxes will have to go up or expenditures will have to be cut, which can cause further feedback effects that exacerbate the direct effects of climate change. And then finally, I'd like to highlight just some new evidence from the United States on how local regulations can improve resilience and be not only effective, but also cost effective depending on the local context. And again, a caveat to my remarks is that they're all focusing on the United States, as this is where I know the evidence base the best. So in line with what Emmanuel was saying earlier, we're already seeing effects of climate change, arguably. So when we look at flooding, for example, flood risk has increased dramatically across many U.S. cities. These are just some numbers from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. In Boston, Massachusetts, for example, in the 1950s, there were 3 floods a year on average, and in the 2010s, about 13 a year. Charleston, South Carolina, we've gone from 0.1 floods a year on average in the 1950s to 6 floods a year in the 2010s. Now, with flooding, of course, we have to be careful. There's spatial development, wetland loss, and many different factors contributing to what we've seen since over the past decades. But looking forward, predictions are implying large increases in flood risk across many U.S. cities. So in New York, for example, some recent estimates suggest a flood risk amplification factor for 100-year flood events, so a proportional increase in the risk of a 100-year flood of about 4 to 5. By mid-century, even under a modest emission scenario. Boston, Massachusetts, the corresponding flood risk amplification factor is about 30 to 50. So quite, again, substantial increases in the risk of flooding. We have to be very careful with these particular estimates is defined as a tidal gauge exceedance level, but still overall flood risks are poised to increase quite substantially across many U.S. cities. Now, one interesting aspect of some of these projections is that population growth and migration, according to, again, some benchmark projections, is set to actually contribute more to increases in aggregate risk exposure than climate change. So these are some recent estimates by Wing et al. Looking at flood risk exposure in the United States, where right now about 1.18% of the U.S. population on average is exposed to flooding in any given year. Climate change by mid-century is predicted to increases to 1.4%, so a substantial increase. But benchmark population growth and migration predictions are set to increase flood risk exposure to 1.6% of the population by the same time. The combined effect increasing exposure to about 1.83%. Now we can tell a similar story in the US about heat exposure. So heat waves have already increased tremendously over the past decades. This is a map of heat wave changes across 50 large U.S. cities from the U.S. EPA, where the orange dots indicate significant increases over time. And we've seen that in some locations, Tampa, Florida, example, there's almost 10 additional heat waves per year now compared to the 1960s. Even in some generally more modest, moderate climate temperate. Sorry, it's late at night here. In some temperate temperature regions such as Seattle, Washington, about 5 additional heat waves per year. Looking forward again at some of the predictions, as we all know intuitively, exposure to extreme heat is set to increase significantly across many locations. So up here, Phoenix, Arizona, for example, which right now gets about 9 to 10 additional days of temperatures above 43 degrees centigrade. This is predicted to increase by an extra 30 to 60 days with temperatures exceeding 43 degrees Celsius by end century, depending on the climate scenario. Charleston, South Carolina, 30 to 70 additional days with temperatures above 35 degrees Celsius, even substantial increases in a moderate emission scenarios. Now, here again, there's some estimates suggesting that migration spatial development is causing or may be set to lead to a substantial increase in the risk as well. So here's some estimates by Jones et al. For the total increase in exposure to extreme heat in person days, where climate by itself, population effects are predicted to have about equiproportional effects, and the interaction between climate and population growth and migration, we're going towards areas of increasing risk, are also predicted to increase about equiproportional to the other factors to overall heat exposure in cities in the United States. Now, in addition to some of these reasonably well understood direct physical risks, there's also emerging evidence of the fiscal pressures that climate change may be putting on many locations. So perhaps the best or most widely studied of these is hurricane events or cyclones in the North Atlantic Basin, where rich literature has shown these to decrease local economic growth, decrease property values, decrease municipal tax revenues, increase municipal borrowing costs, decrease certain local public good expenditures, such as investments in public works, and increase expenditure requirements at higher levels of government, such as income transfer obligations and public healthcare expenditures. There's less but also emerging evidence on similar effects from wildfire events. So recent estimates by Liao and Kulski estimate about a 25 percentage point increase in the probability of a municipal budget deficit in California cities following wildfire events. There's also some evidence that wildfire events increase public healthcare costs at higher levels of government in the United States. Now, in addition to some of the effects on expenditures and revenues that extreme weather events may have, there are also forward-looking predictions of increases in the cost of providing local government services as a result of a changing climate. So US EPA has estimated, for example, across 100 US cities, an increase in annual costs of urban drainage infrastructure of about $5 billion per year by late century in order to keep up with changes in precipitation patterns and maintaining robustness to a 50-year storm event. Road maintenance, of course, is another one where, depending on the location, there may be increases in costs or actually decreases in costs as a result of changes in extreme temperature exposure and changes in freeze-thaw events. So an interesting aspect of this graph from EPA on the right-hand side is that depending on whether we're able to adapt proactively, looking ahead and planning ahead instead of reacting after the damage is done, the cost impact may be extremely different. So there may be net cost savings at the aggregate level in the US on road maintenance, for example, with proactive adaptation, but waiting to adapt until it's too late may imply substantial cost increases on net. Now, some of the evidence of this fiscal impacts is already showing up in financial markets. And in particular, there's now emergent work showing that municipal borrowing costs are pricing in predicted future increases in climatic risks. There's 2 studies now that have looked at the capitalization of future sea level rise exposure into municipal bond prices, finding economically and statistically significant increases in borrowing costs for municipalities as a result of higher sea level rise exposure. And in some ongoing work with some co-authors, we're also finding evidence of capitalization of future wildfire risk increases into municipal bond prices. Now, why do we care about these fiscal effects? Well, of course, there was some talk earlier today about the importance of local fiscal capacity in order to adapt and provide basic public goods. But there's also broader feedback effects that any fiscal impact will have, because a decrease in tax revenues, an increase in expenditure requirements is going to have to be paid somewhere out of the budget. So somewhere taxes are going to have to be increased, and or expenditure on other public goods will have to be reduced. And as a result, there can be feedback effects that further add to the economic burdens of climate change. I don't know of research of this at the local level, where I would suspect it's actually quite substantial, because any local entity, it's harder to raise revenues than at higher levels of government. And in some of my own work looking at the federal level in the United States, I found a quite high sensitivity, actually, of the US social cost of carbon to fiscal impacts. So each 1 percentage point increase in government consumption requirements per degree warming is estimated to increase the social cost of carbon by 20%, and each 1% increase in transfer obligation per degree warming is predicted to increase the social cost of carbon by another 10%. So these feedback effects can exacerbate the overall cost of climate change quite non-trivially. Now, on the bright side, if there is one, there's also emerging evidence from the US that some local policies can be not only effective, but also cost effective. And of course, these options are highly location specific. I think it must be very difficult to know without detailed local study and understanding what the cost benefits of different options are. But for what it's worth, here's an excellent paper by Baylis and Boomhauer looking at wildfire building codes in California that have been adopted in California over the past decades. And the authors estimate a reduction in the probability of a home being destroyed by a given wildfire event of about 40% as a result of California's building codes. Interestingly, building codes also reduce the probability that a wildfire will destroy a neighboring home by 6%. So there's positive spillover benefits in neighborhoods that are sufficiently dense. Now, of course, building codes can be expensive as well. So in this setting, the authors estimate benchmark cost increases for new construction of about $16,000 per home, cost of retrofits about $63,000 per home. And so whether in a cost benefit sense these building codes are worth it depends on both the annual wildfire probability and how densely populated an area is, the number of neighbors. So these are the estimates on the right. Each dot is a zip code in California, and we see the blue zip codes indicate positive net benefits from adopting the building codes. The red zip codes would not have a positive net benefit, conditional on the assumptions underlying these calculations. The last policy that seems like it should really be a no-brainer, certainly from an economist's perspective, is information, better information on risks. And in terms of, does better information lead to reductions or improved resilience or reductions in damages, there are some open questions, or quite a few still in this causal chain, even though we would expect it to be the case. But looking, for example, at the effects of information on flood risk, we know that housing prices respond to flood risk signals. We know they respond to flood risk maps. We know they respond to disclosure laws. One study that I quite love is a case study from Colorado Springs, where a local fire department responded to public demand about better understanding local wildfire risk. And so the local fire department produced estimates of each parcel's wildfire risk. And there was a study looking at the capitalization of fire risk before and after the local fire department put up this website, and they found a significant change in the capitalization of fire risk into local housing markets. Now, so far so good. Evidence also broadly suggests, certainly in the United States, that the capitalization of flood risk into properties prices often appears too low. It's less than what we would expect based on predicted, say, insurance costs or expected damages from flood events. And this lack of capitalization is particularly severe in areas that don't have flood risk disclosure laws, where we would expect information to not be relayed as efficiently, as well as in areas where there's more skepticism of climate change. So unlike in Garad's presentation, I think the US setting is very different in that you do still have a substantial portion of the population that is skeptical of climate risks, present and future. The extent to which better information can reduce damages is also arguably an open question in many domains. One piece where we do have evidence on improved resilience is it does appear that flood risk signals also increase demand for flood insurance as another component of resilience overall. So to summarize, as I think, again, is intuitive to everyone in this room, climate change poses many direct physical as well as indirect, say, fiscal risks to cities. And of course, as we've talked about, adaptation in theory can reduce these damages significantly. One number that often sticks in my head is estimates by Desmet et al. Looking at the global costs of sea level rise, estimating that with optimized migration and investment decisions, we can decrease those damages from 4.5% to 0.1% of global GDP by 2200. But the extent to which this optimized migration investment will occur is, of course, an open question. I think many obstacles remain that need to be better understood and targeted by policy. Again, in the US setting, there's quite a bit of evidence that misinformation may be inhibiting adaptation. There's some evidence by Long et al. Looking at differentials in hurricane evacuation rates after certain public commentators on certain networks made remarks derogatory of the forecasts. There's partisan sorting based on flood risk. So there's certainly those kinds of frictions in the US. As mentioned before, some of the benchmark population predictions in the US do imply an increase in risk as a result of where we're going rather than a reduction. And some seemingly beneficial no-brainer policies such as building codes are not yet as widely adopted as we may think. In the US, about a third of states don't have flood risk disclosure laws, including some where one would think flooding would be very relevant, I believe Florida. So there's certainly a way to go here as well as elsewhere. And I look forward to the other presentations that will tackle these issues directly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lynn. Thank you, and I just wanted to remark that one of the findings that you showed, that the cost effectiveness of more resilience really depend on being able to target those investments in the places with high risks. This is also something that is a conclusion of some of the work we did at the World Bank on infrastructure, and it's very relevant to us because this information, even the basic data that you need to create that information, often doesn't exist in our client countries. So the investment in those information really is key to make those resilience investments cost efficient. Thanks. We'll come back to that. Let me now turn to Aris. Moving there. So moving to Cape Town and the impact of floods on welfare.
All right. Thank you, Stephane. So In the previous session, there was a very important question that the colleague from USAID asked. It was, how do you make this knowledge practical for policymakers? I think it's a super important question, and I was struck by the answer that we got from the academics. They say you have to develop some assessments, some diagnostic tools, and then the policymakers said you have to develop the local knowledge and bring the data to the local capacity. And I think those are very good answers, and this is exactly what we're trying to do, actually, with what I'm going to show you. So for the research part, I want to acknowledge funding from the strategic research program that we had here at the research department of the World Bank, but as well the knowledge for change program that funded part of the development of this model. And for the operational part, I want to acknowledge the city support program, which is our advisory service to the government of South Africa. So I'm going to talk about an urban land use model, and I think having an urban land use model with climate characteristic is something very important to provide to cities, so they can actually understand how climate is going to impact the cities, what's going to happen in different parts of the cities, how the city system is going to respond to those risks, what policies can be implemented, how the city will respond to the policies. And since we're talking about simulation system, we're also talking about quantifying those effects. I think the quantification of all this is very important for policy. Let me just say this is co-written with quite a lot of people. This model has a long history. It builds on a modeling infrastructure that was first developed in France by CIRED, the Center for International Research on Environment and Development, including by the chair of this session, actually, who worked on the model quite a bit, and people also sitting in the room. I don't know if Paolo Avner is here. So let me start. I'm going to say a few quick words on what are urban land use simulation models, and I'll talk about this specific model. I think it's important to talk about a model that is specific to a particular city. In that case, what we want to do is not to have a general framework that you just calibrate to a city. We want to have a model that is really tailored to the city, where the mechanisms and the features of the model really correspond to the reality on the ground. And it's very important for developing countries because they are very different from developed countries, so I'll talk about that. And then I'll show how we introduce risks into the model, and I'll show you two sets of simulations. The first set will be comparing what happens when people have information about the risk or no information about the risk. And there was a lot of discussion during the first session, actually, about the role of information, and the paper that Gerhard Bryan presented, actually, is a lot about that. And the second set of simulation that I'm going to show is about climate change. What happens when the risks actually increase? How does the city respond to that? So very quickly, on one slide, I tried to summarize what can be viewed as not really complex, because we try to have a simple model, but a theoretical model just on one slide. So basically, what do those land use simulation models do? What is the theory behind that? Well, you have three sorts of things you need to account for. First, you have those are two-dimensional or three-dimensional models, if you want, right? So you have the space that is the city. So you have to take into account the geography, which can be constraining. You can have some amenities that are different. When you're close to the shore, you may have the households may value actually proximity to the water, the scenery, etc. But you also have constraints. In Cape Town, you have a mountain in the middle of the city. And then you have institutions and regulation. You can have zoning that can be respected and not respected. You can account for that in the model. And then you have what is very important is the transportation network. This is around the transportation network that people will make choices in terms of where they locate, how they can travel to work, etc. And then you have the agents. So in this type of model, you have three types of agents. You have households, but you also have firms who hire people, but you also have developers who decide to construct. And then all those agents make choices. So I talked about construction, the location of people, where they're going to work, and also the transport mode that they're going to use. And then people are competing for land, actually, right, in terms of where they will locate in the city. So there's a land market, there's a supply, there's a demand determined by all those factors, and this determines some price of housing in different locations, and then this determines the location of people and the city patterns, and it tells you where people live, where they work, and where they travel. So basically, on one slide, this is what those models do. So just super quick, the fundamental theory behind that is the urban economic theory. It tells you that when you're in location, accessibility is important. Accessibility to jobs, accessibility to schools. So people want to be close to places that have good accessibility, but since they're competing with one another, it's going to be more expensive. So you can locate in different places in a city. Either you're close to those places where you want to travel to, but you have to pay a higher price of housing, or you're further away, the price of housing will be lower, but you have to incur the transport costs. So basically, this is the fundamental mechanism within those models. And those are economic models, actually, right? They are some type of equilibrium model where the price of land is determined endogenously. So it really differs from the urban planning approach, where you would just simulate location, etc., but not taking into account the actual determination of the prices. And it's very important to have prices in those models because it gives actually a theory and underpinning of actually the spatial equilibrium that we understand. People do not locate where they are randomly. It's because they participate in this land market. So we need those urban models in order to understand what drives the structure of the city. Based on those theories, we need to be able, with those models, to look at the different economic outcomes. Ultimately, we're interested in the welfare of households. We want to look at how the city, as I said, is affected by shocks, whether it's population, climate, and also the policies, right? There's a long story, actually, beyond those models. Many people have worked on this. I see even Tony Yeser, sitting in this room, has himself worked on quantitative models. There's been a renewed interest in those models with the work of Alfeld, Redding, and others for the past decade, what they call the quantitative urban model, which provides a different technology, different way of modeling the city. But in some sense, all those models are quantitative urban models. Our model is more based on the canonical urban economics model, which we actually apply to a city. So the model infrastructure that we use is called Legium 2D. As I said, it's standard urban economics. It can be based on a monocentric city or polycentric city. Our version of Cape Town is polycentric. We have many city centers there. It's a two-dimensional representation, of the city. You have different modes of transport. There's a static version of the model and a dynamic version of the model. So I'm just going to talk about the static version of the model for today. So these graphs, just show you their inputs, into the model, the constraints that I mentioned in terms of land use, the infrastructure of transport, the total population you want to have in a closed city, construction costs, the income of the household, etc. And then this determines in the end the population density, the rents, dwelling sizes, floor area ratio, etc. So it's really able to model a whole city. Now, I'll move on to the specificity of how we actually tweak that model to apply it to Cape Town. One thing that is important, so we consider a grid, actually, for the city of Cape Town, and each cell is a location. It's 500 meter by 500 meter, and we took the grid the grid that the city of Cape Town itself is using, so we can link up to their information system, and they can make use of the model. So for each cell, you know how much land is available, the zoning restrictions, you know the amenity that you have, exogenous amenity from that location, how accessible that location, the accessibility of that location to other places, here are job subcenters. We know how many houses have been built by the government. This RDP and BNG houses are the social housing that South Africa, has built in order to address the housing shortage for the poor. You know what the informal settlement zones could locally, emerge. So there are places that they can emerge, but the number of informal settlers in those zones is endogenous in our model. So you have 5 transportation modes. There's a private car, of course, and actually people sort across those modes according to income, and all this is endogenous in the model. So you have the private car, the famous minibus, taxi, that many of you might have seen or worked on. But there's also the bus and then the train. So most expensive is the car, less expensive is the train, or even walking. So people can choose among those 5 modes in the model. What is very important here to take into account for South Africa is the housing submarkets. There are 4 housing submarkets. So on the left-hand upper side, you can see this is formal housing. Typical formal housing, more than 80 square meter, on plots over 300 square meters. But then below, you have what I was talking about, the RDP, BNG. BNG stands for Breaking New Ground, which is a national program for building such houses. Those are subsidized houses provided to the poor, South African in particular location. So it has helped a lot with the poor, but there's been a lot of discussion about whether those houses should have been built in situ or not. And when people were granted those houses, they're also been given a backyard, right? So in one sense, they have more space than they would have consumed given their income. And there's a big phenomenon that took place in South Africa is that people started renting out their backyards. They started building shacks, backyard structures in those backyards of the subsidized housing. And then a market actually for backyard structures has emerged, and this is what you see on the top right corner of the slide. You now have more people renting out those backyard structures than people in the traditional informal settlements. So it's really, on the rise. It's very important to have in the model in order to account for how people are housed. And then you have, the informal settlements, usually located on the side of roads or rivers. They're quite, they're not very large actually in extent, but very long. So when you drive from, the airport to the town, you see that. So we have heterogeneous income groups, 4 groups, the very poor, the poor, then let's say middle and higher income. The very poor are eligible, they can go to informal settlements, but they're also eligible to get subsidized housing. They can go to backyard structures, some people choose to go to backyards. It has some advantages of living in an informal settlement. You're in an enclosed, property, maybe there's less violence, etc. You may be closer to jobs, actually. And if you're interested in the backyarding story, I can refer you to the paper that Jan Bruckner, Klaus Rabe, and myself actually wrote. We have a theory model of backyarding, and we test it on Cape Town data, actually. So that's a very important phenomenon to account for. And you have, formal private housing, and all this interacts in the city. So just before talking about the floods, which is the purpose of the speech, let me just tell you that when we calibrated this model, even without the floods, but we recalibrated with the floods, you can see on the left-hand side the actual data in terms of household density, the right-hand side what we are able to simulate with the flood. You can see that it's quite close, actually, so we have a good fit of the model. I'm showing you how housing prices vary when you move away from the city center, how household density, decreases when you move away from the city center. All this is in line with, economic theory, and the simulation fits the data. We have the position informal housing and informal settlements in backyards. But let me talk about the floods. So the left-hand side shows you the floodplains in Cape Town, for those who are, familiar with the city. In that model, we're going to introduce 3 sources, actually, of floods. So we have the fluvial and the pluvial floods. So we take the maps from the Fathom global database. So we know actually the flood risks in each location in the city. We know the depth, of the floods. We know how frequent those floods may be. We have the same information for coastal flooding from the Delta-RES global database. And we look at 2 possible impacts so far. We look at the damages to the structures, that is the building. In the model, we have some depreciation of the building, which was to be taken into account when, a building or rebuilding housing. And we also have the contents damage, the belongings of the household within the housing. Those are pictures of floods in Cape Town. You can see different types, floods. So you can see here it happens in poor areas on those pictures. I'm going to skip quickly over this so I can show you a little bit more later on. So the simulations now. So I'm going to show you some outputs. So we're interested in the urban patterns, how the different income groups sort, across the city, across the different types of housing. And we're interested about the exposure of those different, income groups, different types of housing to floods. And we want to be able to quantify the damages to the contents and the structure. And I want to say that we have some damage functions actually that we use in the model that are specific to each type of housing, that have based on actual measure that's been done for in the literature for Africa, for informal housing in particular. So the first type of simulation I wanted to talk about was comparing what happens in the city when people know about the risk, when they know what places are at risk of a flood, for instance, the fluvial risk, and they know, the flood depths and everything, and they can anticipate actually what choices they're going to make in terms of choosing where to locate in the city. How is this going to affect the competition for land within the city? And they can make different decisions. They can decide to locate somewhere else because the risk is too much for them, or they can decide to build less because they know they will lose some of the, the housing structure, or they can actually take the risk, of residing in flood-prone areas, because given their, income and given their need to work, this is maybe how they maximize their utility. That's one scenario. People know about risks. The other polar scenario, they have no information whatsoever, and they don't account for flood risks. And then we can measure how exposure to the floods varies when people have the information versus when they don't have the information. And I think it's an important issue that was discussed in the previous sessions. So I'm going to show you actually the difference in outcomes, right? What happens when you anticipate versus when you do not anticipate the flood risks. So I'm showing you here the results. So we can look at the different types of floods in isolation. We just, introduce fluvial risks, pluvial floods risks, coastal flood risks, or we can also aggregate all those risks together in some type of, aggregate exposure to all floods at the same time. Here, just looking at fluvial floods, what is very interesting actually, when you look at this graph. So what does this graph show you? It shows you the damages for the structures and for the contents. So the structure is the red and the pink, and the contents is the dark blue and the light blue. The dark colors is when you anticipate, right? And the light colors, so the two are overlaid, right, is when you do not anticipate. So what you see is when you don't anticipate fluvial flood risks, the total damage in the city we estimate to be in 2011 rands, 570 million rands. That's, if you want, you can divide it by 7 if you want to have the dollar equivalent. But when you anticipate the risks, the damage is reduced by half, right? So information plays a very important role here. What is very interesting also is that you see that it's also a composition effect, that the risks are actually borne mostly by formal housing, because the damages are borne by formal housing because, formal houses are more expensive, so in absolute terms, the damages that they face is greater. You have a lot of people in formal private housing as well. And what you see also is that the risks, the damages are greater for the structures than for the content, right? The red bar is much higher than the blue bar. Informal private housing, but in informal settlements, what you have, it's about the same, right? So the value of housing is very low in informal settlements, but people lose a lot also from losing the contents that they have within their shacks. I'm showing you the same for pluvial floods. It's exactly the same story. The damages are much less, right? 165 million. We had 570 million for the fluvial risks. Obviously, when you provide information to people, the damages are lowered because people can relocate and make different choices within the cities. There's less scope for adjustment actually to the risk when you look at the rain, right? Because it rains everywhere. Whereas when you look at the overflow of the rivers, obviously it's much more localized, so people can respond in terms of relocating. When you look at coastal floods, you see it's mostly the formal sector which is affected, because this is where you find the rich areas with a nice view on the shore. This is the flood damages. When you aggregate all risks together, and we try to show you a map where we look at the damage per cell, each 500 by 500 meter cell. You can see it goes up to 30 million rands annually in a given cell. And this is the change in the aggregate flood damages that you see when people do not have information on the risk, as opposed to when they can anticipate it. Anyway, I'm going to stop to continue. So we have pictures. So people relocate. So we can show you maps of how they relocate. Obviously, this is quite localized, so you don't see much on the big picture, but you can see people move out of flood zones and in zones that are less flooded. You can see here there's a bit of red and a little bit of blue. So the places that people live have lower rents, and the places where people want to go to, and they actually relocate to nearby places, have an increase in the rents. So it can help the city understand what's happening here. Since I'm almost done with my time, I'm going to finish very quickly on the climate change scenario, just to tell you what we do, basically. So we consider the infamous RCP 8.5 scenarios for coastal flood risks. For the fluvial and pluvial risks, what we do is we multiply the frequency, actually, of floods by 2, which is a change actually quite similar to the RCP 8.5 scenario for coastal risks. And here we're showing you, again, maps about the damages from an increase in the frequency of floods. And you can see, again, that the formal private sector is more affected than the other sector, and what happens when you have the information was just not, you don't have the information on risks. So basically, I'm just going to show you one more slide to tell you that the distribution of the damages, if you look at just at the flood-prone areas, and if you just look at the poorest in income group 1, those are the poorest people, as a share of their income. This distribution shows you that the average damage of those households is 1.3% of their net income every year. When they do not have the information, but when they have the information on flood risks, what happens in the city system is such that the damage is halved. It's divided by 2, and there are movements out of flood zones when the risks are anticipated, and I can show you this on these maps. I'm going to go quickly, and there's also an impact on rents. So just as a very quick conclusion, I think it's important to have this type of tool, and we're trying to build the capacity with Cape Town. Actually, we're embedding the model with the city of Cape Town. We have trained an urban planner there, actually. We have shared the code with them. I'm going to share the code with everyone, actually. It's going to be online very soon. You need a model because the structure of the city is not invariant. When you shock it, it's going to respond. People are going to relocate. The city is going to look differently. So you cannot just intersect the actual structure of the city with the flood information. You have to understand how the whole system works. It's a quantitative tool. It is simple, tractable, adaptable. I said open source. And it can be used by local governments. This was more like a pilot that we were doing with them. We've shown that the impacts of floods in Cape Town, they vary a lot. In absolute terms, the rich are more affected, but in relative terms, the poor, people who live in slums, in flood-prone areas, are very much affected. So the next steps for us is to look at other costs. There was discussion of the health costs, the fact that you're going to miss work when the transport is flooded, what type of protection investments people can have, whether it's a self investment or it's a public investment by the local government, and we can do a benefit cost analysis of protection investments. I'm going to stop here. I'm just telling you that we have an online resource. Again, so we are finalizing it, but you have a description of the whole model. You can download the code, you can run it, you can run your own simulation, you can adapt it to your context, you can recalibrate. So this is really a tool we want to disseminate as much as we can. And I'm going to stop here, and I apologize for talking for too long.
Thank you very much, Aris. Thank you. So, he's there already. Great. Remi, over to you.
Here we go. Hi, everyone. So my name is Remi. I'm the other co-organizer of the conference, and thanks for being here today. So I'm going to talk about durable skyscrapers and future climate change. Here we go. All right, so let me give you an example. So the Gulf is where the world has built the most in terms of volume and value in the past 20 years. This is a photo of Dubai on the left. At the same time, there's some studies that say that in 50 years, it's going to be too hot to live in Dubai for like 3 or 4 months of the year. So we're going to reach temperatures around 60 Celsius degrees. So it seems that we're building the most in some of the locations that may become the worst. So why is that an issue? Well, to adapt to climate change, humans can move. So that's one margin of adjustment, that's migration. And then we have capital, like machines and all that. And we know that eventually capital can move, or you can have depreciation. So after 50 years, capital is fully depreciated. So maybe if you have climate change in 50 years, there is less of a cost. But the thing with tall buildings or skyscrapers, they don't move. They're fixed in space. They're very durable, and they're very expensive. So there may be a global dynamic spatial misallocation problem for durable skyscrapers that are built to last. On the left, this is an Empire State Building. It was built 1 century ago, it's still here. And all these buildings on the right are built to last. So they're built to last 1 century at least. All right. So in this paper, we use novel data to try to investigate whether tall buildings are being built away from these future bad locations in terms of extreme heat. We do analysis both within countries, so like comparing cities within the same country, or comparing world cities. We don't find that the tallest and most durable buildings are being built away from these future bad locations. It's the same after Kyoto. So even if you get more and more information about climate change, it doesn't seem that you have changes in construction patterns globally. And then I'm going to show you that less democratic countries build more skyscrapers in future bad locations. Okay, so sample, we have 13,000 cities. We're going to consider the 20th century. We have down climate change from the CCKP data set to the World Bank. We have temperatures every 20 years in the future. We consider a pessimistic scenario because according to some studies, this is a current scenario. And a new data set that we're using for this study is called MPOIS. So we have data on the location and height and year of construction of all tall buildings in the world. This is a database. So this, for each building, we're going to have a dot, and then we have information on a building. So these are buildings above 55 meters. In a different paper with Klaus-Denninger, maybe in a room, we use satellite data, and we find that the tall buildings account for 8% of the global tall city volume. In a city like Dubai, that's 22%. 22% of the volume of Dubai is in these tall buildings. Probably in terms of value, it's much more than that because they're also more expensive. And over the course of the 20th century, you had this skyscraper revolution. So like from 1975 to 2020, you have more or less like 12,000 kilometers. That's 26,000 Empire State buildings, or 3 times the distance between New York City and LA. So the world has been building a lot. This is the map of skyscrapers in 75. And then over the past 50 years, you get more skyscrapers everywhere in the world. And really the question we're asking is like, where are these skyscrapers built? Are they built in good locations or bad locations? Okay. This is showing the location of our cities. And in dark here, you have areas that are very hot today. So these are like, this is a Seattle, which is the hottest place on Earth. And this is in 50 years. So in 50 years, you're going to have many more regions with this, very hot climate, like in a Seattle. And the question, like, do we see more skyscrapers in this location or fewer skyscrapers in these locations over time? All right. We already discussed from Michael Michael's presentation the effect of climate change. Something I'm going to add is like, if you think of Dubai, is like climate change may impact the connectivity and the attractiveness of Dubai because planes can only operate at a temperature up to 53 Celsius degrees. So when we're going to reach temperatures of 60 degrees, unless we have better planes in that time, which is possible, then the airport of Dubai will be closed for like a week or 2 weeks, and that may impact the attractiveness of Dubai. But we may have new planes in 50 years. So what is optimality in a study like this one? Well, it depends on you have option value cost of durable structures in future bad locations. Obviously, the developers and buyers, they have a limited horizon, so they don't really care about what's happening in 50 years. The government have a somewhat less limited horizon, but they have political incentives. What will domestic social planner do? Well, domestic social planner will try to hedge domestic durable construction against future climate change. So maybe let's try to build away from future bad locations. And a global social planner, I don't know if that's a World Bank or a different institution, but they will try to hedge global durable construction against climate change. Yeah. Now, if you focus on skyscrapers and super tall towers, they're very durable. They're very expensive. There's global competition, which means that typically they're owned by international companies and they're rented or occupied by internationally mobile firms, workers, and residents. If a location becomes less valuable, people move to a different location. If Dubai becomes less interesting in 50 years because of the climate, people are going to move to, say, Singapore or Hong Kong or New York. At the same time, tall buildings can also help adapt to climate change because you can work and live in the same structure. So are tall buildings a problem or are tall buildings a solution with climate change? Okay. So we use our data to try to test if the world is overbuilding in bad location. It's very difficult to say because we don't know future technology. And we see if the patterns in the world change as you get more information about climate change. So it's a very simple regression. We have 13,000 cities in 180 countries over 1 century. We have a log sum of height on the left-hand side. And we have this FBL index of orally you're going to transition to these like unsustainable temperatures. And then with city fixed effect, country year fixed effect. If you focus on global mesolocation, you want to compare cities in the world rather than cities in the same country year. So in that case, you're going to have a year fixed effect instead of country year fixed effect. This is an inverted U relationship between temperatures and height. This is very similar to the graph with productivity in cities. As you see, you have very few cities on the right. The only few cities with very high temperatures, and a lot of buildings are going to be cities with, oil countries. The oil is produced in these countries. The oil money usually is associated with skyscrapers. You get skyscrapers. So we create our FBL index here, which has a higher value if you transition to an unsustainable temperature early on. Like, have you already transitioned right now? You're going to transition in 20 years, in 50 years. So the value of 5 means you're transitioned right now, you're a bad location right now already. And a value of 0 means they're going to transition maybe in 1 century. Yeah. Right. So this is globally, this is when we compare cities in the world, what we find that the world is building away from its future bad locations, so that's a good news. At the same time, that's not true for the most durable skyscrapers. If you look at buildings above 170 meters or 195 meters, since the 1990s, actually, we're building towards the future bad locations. And we know that this effect is driven by the Gulf. Right? Now, within countries, like within India, within the US, within Saudi Arabia, we find that actually the world is building towards these future bad locations. To some extent, this is because of some innovations. We have the AC that was invented in the 1930s. We also have changes in preferences. People like to have a swimming pool. People like the hot weather. People are moving to these warm locations. But it is nice until it is not. So maybe moving to Dubai today is nice in the winter, but it may be really bad in 50 years. So then the skyscrapers, the durable skyscrapers, will be stranded assets. Do we see a change with Kyoto? So I do some of the analysis where I interact with a dummy year after the Kyoto period. And we don't see that after Kyoto, like tall buildings are moving away from the future bad locations. We don't see any adjustment here. Same if we control for like tall building demand, so we can have controls for like population, economic growth, technology. Still, we don't find that buildings are moving away from these bad locations. We also see no effect of Doha or no effect of Paris. Like every time there is a new COP conference, you don't really see changes in the construction patterns globally. They're still building durable skyscrapers in this very hot location, or location not very hot now, but going to become really hot in 50 years. We get the same result if we do extremely hot days, dangerous days. We also have that on planned buildings. So for all the cities in the world, we know the buildings they're going to plan. They're planning to build in the 2020s. So it tells us something about the future to see if you have some adjustment. And we don't see much here. All right, I'm almost done. So 40 countries in our data have these FBL cities. Like cities are going to have temperatures above 50 Celsius degrees for like several months of the year. Among the 10 countries with the highest FBL index in cities, 4 of these countries are in the Gulf. But you have 6 countries outside these countries, like including India, actually. And what we see here is that the coefficients are typically more negative for non-Gulf countries. So like outside the Gulf, it seems that the durable construction is moving away from the bad locations. So there is some adjustment, but within the Gulf, it's not happening. If anything, they're building towards the FBLs. Like within Saudi Arabia, they're building a lot in the worst location in Saudi Arabia. That's more or less the result. The other thing as well here is that you can compare the coefficient for the durable skyscrapers, like above 200 meters, and the ones like from the buildings around 55 meters, 60 meters. A building that is 55 or 60 meters, typically the depreciation is after like 30, 40 years. So the cost of climate change is smaller because the buildings will have fully depreciated. Maybe in 40 years, we're going to replace a building. So it doesn't matter if the location is not valuable anymore because the value of the building will be lower anyway. But with a durable skyscraper, the value will still be there. And because of durability, the building will still be there in 1 century. So if anything, we're expected that maybe we expect like very negative coefficient for buildings, the very durable skyscraper for like 200 meters. And we don't care so much about the coefficient for buildings around 55 meters. But if anything, we see the reverse here. We see that for the Gulf, when we have all the countries in the world, the coefficient is equal to 0. But for the 55 meters, the coefficient is negative. So the small buildings are moving away from a future bad location, but the very tall buildings, the very durable buildings, are actually moving not away from the future bad locations. Then we do an interaction with a democracy variable, since we have all the countries in the world. And we find that this non-adjustment is really led by non-democratic countries. And among the non-democratic countries is driven by the more autocratic countries. So you have anocratic countries, that are like imperfectly democratic countries. That's where you have elections, but you have only like one party or two parties. And then you have the autocratic countries where you have no elections. And as you can see, the effects are driven by autocratic countries. And this is true as well if you drop the Gulf. So it's not just driven by the Gulf countries. Last year, I did some interaction with income status of countries. I find that it's driven by more developed economies and by developing economies. And there are two explanations here. Like, it could be that the developed economies are very optimistic that we're going to have a technology in 50 years. Or maybe they're very optimistic that the tall buildings are the solution when you're going to have extreme heat. So in that case, well, maybe it makes sense to build a lot of tall buildings in Dubai. The other possibility is that you have political incentives in these areas to overbuild skyscrapers. So Gulf nations typically are not democratic, and typically they have what I call developer autocrats. So the rulers are also the biggest developers of the country. It's very much like Singapore in the past. And so they own a lot of the land. Actually, they're the biggest landowner. They're also the biggest developer. So typically, they also have a development company on the side. And so the question, like, they may gain from the construction boom themselves, but the question is, like, what about like Dubai in 50 years? How much do you want to diversify your portfolio of skyscrapers and maybe invest some of that money in international non-FBL? So maybe it makes sense that Dubai and Riyadh buy a lot of buildings in London. To some extent, it's a good insurance strategy to hedge the future portfolio of wealth of your country against future climate change. The US is an interesting case. We see a lot of construction in the southwest of the US when we know that Phoenix and Las Vegas are going to be really impacted by climate change in 50 years. It could be that this is because the US is a decentralized democracy. So incumbent state politicians may have an incentive to overdevelop their state because they get elected by people from the state, whereas maybe in more centralized democracies, the incentives are more to edge the whole urban system. So I'm going to stop here. I want to say that this was a very preliminary draft and presentation, and so we'll really welcome your comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'll turn to Nancy now.
So 5 minutes? 10?
You should be right here.
Perfect. Excellent. Well, let me actually start with the paper that Harris presented. I think you'll see throughout the comments that many of the thoughts that came to my mind actually when I was listening to the presentations, but also reading the paper from Remi, are consistent with some of the things that have been highlighted throughout the morning and the other sessions today. First, I want to stress one thing that actually Harris mentioned at the very beginning of his presentation, which is why, or the value of these kind of models, of these tools, to actually inform policy decisions at the city level. In the morning, in most of the presentations, we were talking about global models, and here we're really trying to bring it down to the city level. And I think that's, it's also response to some of the questions in terms of policy making that we were hearing in all the other sessions. It is also, we've heard about improvements in estimating the damages brought by many of the risks posed by climate change. But I think these, the work that Harris and co-authors have done really helps us better understanding the interactions. Sorry, my voice. Can I have some water? The interactions between city structure, the policies that are taken to manage that city structure, thank you, and climate change. But I think the question is really, so if we all know that this is what's going to really inform policy on the ground, if we know this is going to make the difference to answer the questions that we were hearing in the morning in terms of policymakers, then why isn't it that we're doing it in all the cities that we work on? And the obvious answer that I'm sure all of you know is the challenges of data, right? So we need information on this, on the spatial distribution of households, on where households work, on where they live. We need information on floods. And in many of the cities that we work on, this data is not available, but there is hope. There are new methods that can actually allow us to get some information on where people work and where they live, for example, from cell phone data. And some of actually Harris co-authors have actually worked in this area. There is also the challenges in terms of flood data. So the information that Harris and team were using on global flood data is very useful. We need to make an additional effort to get at the granularity at the city level to get additional data with more granularity at the city level. But then again, there are the trade-offs of costs with, of course, data with additional granularity being much more costly and difficult to attain. So really, the question is where to go from here, I think. And I think one of the areas that we still need to get much more or better understanding is at the interaction between climate risk and other risks. So the multiplicity of risks and how they interact, what are the compounded effects between the different risks, and how they interact with the policies that policymakers can actually implement. One risk, or rather than risk, I should mention it as a shock that we have been discussing also throughout this morning is migration. And thinking about how to include different migration scenarios in these kind of models I think will be important to consider, or as a way to reflect the uncertainty that we have in terms not only of future climate scenarios, but the impacts that will have on behavior, migration, but also, for example, on preferences. And that links back to the importance of considering multiplicity of risks and how they interact with each other. There is also the issue of heterogeneity, and I think this model takes a very important step in actually taking into account some of the important, taking into account heterogeneity of agents, and in this case of households. Here, considering whether they are informed or not, whether formal or informal, but we need more work on the coping, on the capacity of coping of those households, and I think Harris actually already mentioned it as an area of extension. One area that actually I think it's important as it ties to information, and I think some of the discussion earlier today as well, is better understanding of what are the bottlenecks that households face in their location decisions. Because as we heard earlier today also, how in the case of migration, households did not seem to change behavior with even after receiving additional information on risk, but is it really information the main bottleneck, the most binding constraint that they face? And I think better understanding of the location decisions will actually allow us to identify those binding constraints and identify whether then to provide options for households, we need better information, or we need incentives, or to protect them, we actually need just an effort on better insurance mechanisms. Harris also mentioned the importance of capacity, and I think we often forget to talk about that. We talk about providing the evidence, building the tools, but I think if we really want to make an impact on cities, we need to think about how to transfer this knowledge into capacity on the ground. Let me now move to the second paper that Remi presented. And I think it was interesting to have these two together because Remi took us from an example on shocks to an example on a slow onset event like temperature. So the question I think is, why should we care about this? We heard it earlier today, and Remi also pointed at some of these things, why we should care about heat in cities. We talked about productivity impacts, price impacts, quality of life impacts, and impacts on the performance or the quality of infrastructure. But there are also some other effects that we haven't discussed much today, which are the impacts on violence, for example. And there is some recent evidence linking temperature to violence, in particular gender-based violence. So I think this is also an area that it may be worth exploring in the future. But I think even if we know many of these, the links between heat and the impacts that they can have, I think bringing it down to the city level, there are still some gaps. And I think that's an area where we need to understand better where are the costs, who are the most affected, how do we get to those most vulnerable populations. There is also the question of, okay, but heat can be mitigated, so when should we care? And I think linking back to the analysis that Remi presented, I think we should be caring about high buildings if we believe they are a reflection of capital investments that should actually be happening elsewhere. Why should we worry about it? And so the evidence that Remi is showing is that this is actually happening more so in the developed world, not in developing countries. But also very interestingly, and like lack of time didn't allow him to go into the differentiation of building types, which I think is very important. He finds that this effect is really for government buildings, more so than residential. And I think that's an important differentiation because it brings us to the political economy of these issues and something that we need to think about. We should worry about it. Why? Because maybe now it's not an issue in countries that are developing because technology adoption has been slow, building high is difficult, but with the pressures, the demand pressures that countries are facing, it may become very well a problem in the future. And thinking about how to guide those investments away from risky areas will be, or maybe increasingly important. And the question is then what to do about it. And here I want to bring a report that has been mentioned several times today. It's a report that is called Thriving, Making Cities Green, Inclusive, and Resilience in a Changing Climate. So this report provides, no surprise that the answer to what to do is very consistent with many of the issues or the topics that have been consistent throughout the presentations today. But this report tells us that actions are needed in information. We've heard it everywhere. Institutions, we heard it even in the keynote speech when institutions are also regulation, investments, incentives, but also integration, a topic that is mentioned in Remi's paper. The information and institutions that can actually allow private agents to take better decisions, better informed decisions, but also innovation to facilitate changes in technology that can allow, for example, to use technologies that control climate better, and that could be very well nature-based solutions in cities. And then incentives and integration, because many of these cities are not real substitutes to each other. So only if they're integrated can they be viable options for people and firms to locate to locations that will not be bad in the future. Then there is, of course, the point of uncertainty and how we consider it in terms of what is good and what is bad in the future, something that has been mentioned throughout. On where to go next, I think the story on China is kind of hidden, and it would be important to have it out more prominently given the construction of high buildings in China since the 75s, but also getting a little bit of more nuances in terms of understanding regional differences for your results, and given the differences that you're already seeing by building type. I think better understanding the degree of substitution between cities will be important. And that can be done with some simple proxies for global cities. If you think about international airports, for example, and their connectivity to other cities, or for within country looking at even just the connectivity between cities or access to services. But then I think it's also important to discuss the role of land supply constraints, which actually may limit the sustainability, is that a word, of cities. Some parting thoughts, some thoughts that I've already mentioned, but I think I would like to stress, is really the importance of thinking about how to interact these many risks that collide in cities that may compound and that may have also impacts on what are the best policies, what are the optimal policies that need to be chosen. Uncertainty, we've mentioned it throughout the sessions, and I think it's important to think about how are we going to bring the different options to policymakers, how we help them think about deeper uncertainty, and even if that cannot be taken into account into the modeling, then how do we present a range of results by being better at considering different assumptions in the model from early on. Just the role of information that we've stressed throughout, and let me just close stressing again the role of institutions and capacity building as really the way to have an impact at the local level. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Nancy. So we can open now to questions from the room. So if you want to just walk to the mics, thank you.
So I have a question for Remi. I'm Stephane, professor from MIT. So my question is about for your bad location.
Yeah, we can hear you in the room, but I'm not sure that the mic is open.
So the bad location, you mainly use the temperature to define very hot places. Whether you have thought about this flooding, again, flooding, for those places that are much more easier to get flooded, either sunny day flooding or some flooding because of hurricane, like flood zone. Because I feel like in these places it's more vulnerable for flooding, then maybe there's a higher cost to build there because maybe the government have stringent building codes, say you must elevate, or you have some sophisticated engineering thing for the basement. So, and yes, and maybe the developers will be more sensitive to that cost, because I feel like hot, basically you just install AC, or it's a window, or the settings may be easier for them to handle, but for flooding, maybe it's more costly, and then they will avoid those locations. I think that's something I'm thinking about.
So since we're already late, I'll just offer another opportunity. Yeah, please go ahead. No, I don't think so. Maybe you can walk to the first one.
I'm Lucy Mize with USAID. I'm curious on the floods. If you look at the element of civic management of the flood, so for example in Jakarta, a city very prone to floods, they look at solid waste obstruction of floodgates and it amplifies the impact. And it's a second element that is necessary to manage the flooding patterns of the city. So in your South Africa, was that at all considered in your, could it be, or should it be?
Thank you. So if there is last chance in the room before I reopen to our, last one, and then I'll reopen to our panelists. And you have a brand new mic, so it should work beautifully.
So I really like Nancy's comments, and I guess I would characterize the things as big data and big models. And I wonder, and I think in cities where you have so many second and third order effects, it's really good to have a model such as Harris was talking about. But at the same time, I wonder, should you do anything more than just have this as illustrative? These are very hard things to quantify, and it gives you you try to get all the terms, just as the former speaker said, in front of you, but it's very difficult to get those interactions in a model like that, and people shouldn't count on them for more than just an illustrative guide for what they're doing, as opposed to big data, which I think can be almost atheoretical in saying, what is this pointing us to? And so I think they're both, and Nancy kind of raised some of these in different ways, but they were great talks, and I just would like to get Harris's reaction to that.
Thank you very much. And maybe I'll add one point to Harris, because, and maybe it's related to this last question, because the question is what policies can you test so that you have counterfactuals and you can really explain the difference between doing A and B to a policymaker. And the thing that you mentioned, there is a dynamic model, but what I found missing in the presentation a little bit is that time dimension, that maybe people can shift transport mode overnight. They can move, but it might take a few months, and we can change the height of the building and so on, but it might take a few years. And how do those different in timing play out in the assessment of policies? And maybe that's also a difference in the model and the data, because the data tells you the trends, but those different time horizon are kind of like difficult to capture in those approaches. So I'll suggest we just go through the same order. So Harris, Remi, Nancy, and I don't know if Lint is still connected, but if she is, she might have the last words. We have to be quick because we're late. So Harry first.
Okay, no, I'll try to be quick. Just to answer, Bob's very important question. First of all, I think the cities should not count on just one model. When Paris worked on the Greater Paris, investment, where they built all the transportation networks, etc., they commissioned 4 such models actually, so they could look at the different predictions from the different models. And this is actually what the city of Cape Town is doing. There are 2, models running with different technologies. The advantage of our model actually, compared to previous models, is that they are like previous models was very, very complex, very non-tractable, difficult to understand the mechanism. In our case, we came up with just a few equations that capture the quintessential, the essence actually of the market, of how the city functions. So we quite understand actually what's happening, why people relocate, what happens, etc. And the model is very useful, as Stephane said, to produce some counterfactuals. For resilience also, but any other thing? I think Ed Glazer was mentioning this morning, do we want to have like urban growth boundaries, for instance, in order to densify the cities? It's a simulation that we ran actually with the model on Cape Town, because they had thought of an urban growth boundary at one point. And what we show in a working paper is that if you restrict the extent, of the city, you kind of restrict the supply, so the price of formal housing goes up, and then people go into informal settlements actually. So there's some kind of unexpected, unanticipated effect that the policymakers were really interested in, seeing when they had considered this question of the urban growth boundary. So I think it's useful, and we understand why things, take shape. I think maybe the second question from Stephane was about the dynamics of the model. I just, so this is a process in the making, right? I just wanted to demonstrate the tool that we have, not to look at a research question or present a research paper, but we've run some simulations on the dynamic version of the model, and someone had asked about what about migration. So the city of Cape Town, has come up with scenarios of migration over time that we can shock the model with, mostly rural migration from the rural areas from the Western Cape. So we do take into account also the dynamic version. And then very quickly on the question of the type of defense protection, against floods that people can do, what happens at a very local level. I think this relates to the data issue and the cost of getting the right information in order to run those, to look at those issues in the model. So in terms of costs, I want to say 2 things very quickly. There are 2 types of costs. There's the cost related with the modeling and the building of the model and running the model, and we're bringing that down close to zero because we're making it open source. So it's very important, but there remains the cost of the data. And I know that City of Cape Town is one of the most advanced cities in Africa in terms of data access and capacity of its staff, etc. But they don't have, a map, specific map for flood risks. We have to use the global maps that are, don't take into account the specificity of the elevation within the city, and when the water flows through, one area, there's an obstacle here, it's going to go around and go to that other place, etc. It's very important if you really, really want to look at what happened in those models. So I think it's very important that to find a way of commissioning, streamlining the process of generating such data for the future of those models. And there needs to be some discussion at the global level how we can support that, I think.
Thanks, Remi.
Yeah, regarding the question on flooding, I think there are a lot of great papers on flooding and slums. And the question was like tall buildings are a solution when you have floodings. If you have temporary floodings, it's good to have tall buildings, I guess. When you have sea level rise, which is more like permanent flooding, you don't want the tall buildings close to the sea. You want them just at the edge of the areas that are going to be flooded in 50 years, and that's where local government can subsidize specific location or have regulations in the future bad location. But I think that would be interesting to think of flooding and tall buildings and not just floodings in the other side of the housing market. And there was discussion about can we adapt to future heat? I think we can obviously adapt to 40 Celsius degrees. We know that. Can we adapt to 60 degrees? We don't know yet. So it will depend on future technologies in the next 50 years, which we don't know yet. So that's where there's some uncertainty.
I don't think the question was for me, but I think I'll pick it up on the big data versus big models that Bob was raising. I don't see them as opposites. I actually see them as very good complements. I think I was mentioning an example where I actually think that big data can actually serve as an input for the kind of models that Harris was presenting, by providing from cell phone data an estimate of where people live or where they work, and actually being able to use that as an input. I think big data can help us to understand what's happening, or even to get good predictions, or one could use them to get a prediction of where things are going to happen and how. But I think this kind of models complement what big data can get us by actually allowing us to understand the impacts of certain shocks or policies, and using this as a tool actually to engage with governments on what are their options and what are the possible impacts of the different policies that they have at hand.
Thank you. So I don't know if Lint wants to close the session for us. Maybe not. So in that case, here she is. No, you're good?
I was just going to thank everyone for really insightful remarks and questions. I have nothing to add.
Good. So you have stolen my line. So I just wanted to invite you to thank our panelists for us. And we're sorry for the little late, but we started late too, so I hope it was worth your time. Thanks a lot, and see you for the rest of the event.
We'll do a short 10 minutes break, coffee, and then the last session, probably going to finish at 5:20.